We're back to where we were before. I added the sketch settings and material. The other thing is I've unhidden the background object and enabled the floor, well, it's a disk object. With the disk object, by the way, what I've done is I've just created a simple material with an alpha so that it fades off into the background. Let's switch to our layer browser and we can then hide our scene elements once again, just to hide them from view. But you can see from the render that we're back to no splines being rendered, so we need to have a look at some options to create some geometry. Well, one of the things we can do is we can sweep a spline along the length of our tracer. If we select the tracer and switch to attributes, you can see that I have actually left the reverse sequence option checked. Let's just, with our tracer object selected, press and hold down the Alt key and come up and add in a sweep nurbs. By pressing Alt, what happens is our sweep nurbs becomes a parent of the selected object. Next thing we need to do is we need to say, okay, what spline would I like to trace along the length of our tracer? An obvious example for this would be the circle spline. So with the sweep nurbs selected, let's hold down shift, and by holding shift it will add the object as a child. And let's come and add in a circle spline. Okay, so you can see that's given us a result immediately, and it looks a little bit of a mess at the moment, and the reason for that is because our circle spline is much too big. With the circle object spline selected in the attribute manager, let's set the radius to something a little bit more sensible, such as 2. And there we go, and you can see that now we've created these kind of pipe tube objects where our splines have been generated. We do need to be a little bit careful when using the circle spline at its default settings. If we select our sweep nurbs, you can see that in the editor view everything looks kind of pure white. I'm just going to come up to my cameras and choose editor camera. Okay, we're already on editor camera, so just to retain this camera view, I'm going to come up here and just add in a camera. I'm not going to click to make this active, but because we're in this position, it will automatically set our camera there. I can now select my sweep nurbs and I can just zoom in a little bit because I just want to show you the amount of polygons that are being generated. And as you can see, there's a hell of a lot there. If we come to the objects menu, objects, and choose object information, you can see that this object, the sweep nurbs, is in fact nearly 124,000 polygons. So if we come down and select our circle spline, let's select intermediate points and let's set this to something such as natural, and let's decrease the number to around 2. Now you will notice a slight difference in the editor view, and you can see the edges very slightly here, and that's because we've zoomed in so close. So if you are going up close, then you may want to use a slightly higher value. If however we select the sweep nurbs now, you can see that we have so much less polygons, and if we come to our object information, you can see that now we have nearly 22,000. So we've kind of saved about 100,000 polygons from doing this. I can imagine that this object will only be one element within your scene, so if we can save 100,000 polygons off each object that we add, then we're going to make quite a big difference to our overall performance. Okay, we can safely click that, and let's just select this small icon next to the camera to jump back to our camera view. With the sweep nurbs object selected, come down to the object tab in the attributes manager. You can see within here that we have a few options to adjust our sweep, and one of the things we could do in here is we could set our end scale to be 0, and you can see that by doing that, that gives us a nice trail, almost like a sort of worm to our sweep. You can see that the light dome's working quite nicely, and we're getting quite a nice result with our render already. We could, however, add in a nice simple material here, so I'm just going to double click in the material manager. I'm just going to create a material and just call this gradient for now. In the color tab, let's choose to add in a simple gradient. Click to open up our gradient settings. For this gradient, I'm going to select the first knot and give this a kind of light blue color like so. Let's just pull this down a little bit. Let's select the next white knot and let's make this just a slightly warm yellow, like so. If we drag this gradient onto our sweep nurbs, let's render to see the result. You can see that at the moment the gradient is travelling from the top to bottom. I'd rather that the gradient travelled along the length of the spline. So if we come back, open up our gradient settings, this time set the type to 2DV. And now if we render, you can see that our sweep starts off with the kind of light yellowy beige colour and travels through to the blue. This would probably look nicer if we had rounded caps on the end of our sweeps. So we can select the sweep NURBS and then in the attribute manager switch to the caps tab, and here we can choose fillet cap. You can see that it does make it rounder, so you may want to check constrain just to keep the size the same. But you can see that now if we render we have a problem with our caps because they're kind of inverting themselves. So we need to make sure that the radius is reasonably small. Let's set this to 2.5, perhaps even lower, 2. Our circle had a radius of 2, so 2 should be okay. And if we set the number of steps to around 4 or 5, we should get a nice rounded cap. Of course, you can now see that we have a problem where the cap is a separate part of the geometry. The gradient is being mapped along the cap as well. So we're going to need to fix that, and what we can do is we can apply a material just to the cap itself. So it's probably a good idea to open up the gradient and copy the color of this yellow knot, just so the color is exactly the same. Unfortunately, you can't just select a knot and copy it, but we can get around that by showing the subchannels of our gradient. And to do this, we right click on the word gradient and choose show subchannels. And this gives us the option to access the information about each of our knots. And this is great if you want to animate any of these parameters as well, because you can then animate the color or the position of the gradient individually without actually keying the main gradient itself. So it offers you a lot more control. In this example here, we're just going to right click on the color and choose copy. Let's add in a new material, and in the color channel we can right click on the word color and choose paste, and you can see that now we've done that, we have our yellow color. So I'm just going to rename this yellow. Next, drag this up and drop it onto the sweep NURBS. If we just drop that on when we render, you can see that our sweep becomes yellow all over. So we need to assign this to a selection. And what we're actually going to assign it to is the rounding of our cap. And we can do that using a hidden selection set. And all you need to do to access this is in this selection slot, type in R1. If we then render now, you can see that we have indeed assign that color to the cap or the rounding only, and we have our gradient along the rest of our spline, and it just looks a little bit nicer with a nice rounded cap on the end.